Friends, welcome to this special webinar recording that we are doing in February of 2023. As you recall, our regular scheduled night was on Ash Wednesday, and many of us were out having ashes put on our heads instead of paying attention to treasurer issues. I hope you were too. But we have a special niche recording. Frankly, we hope that most of you will never need this. But for those of you who do, here's some important information that will help as you're going through a transition. So, Eric and Clyde, welcome back. We're glad to have you here and waiting to hear what you have to say.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Eric Matheson, I'll kick things off. And, as we do in a live recording, I just want to say all three of us, Stephen, Clyde, and I, are in Toronto. So we just want to take a moment for a land acknowledgement to say that we in Toronto acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We're grateful for the opportunity to live and work here, and we thank all the generations of people who've taken care of this land for thousands of years. This recognition must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. So with that, as Stephen said, the topic today is organizational changes. And if you don't ever have to make one, that's good news. And that's what we mean by a niche offering. So because we are on ChurchX and hopefully expanding our reach as we encourage everyone to use ChurchX as a reference and educational tool, just a brief bio for Clyde and I, who've been doing webinars together for some number of years. There's some COVID blurring in there, Clyde, but I think it's probably 4 years or so. And both Clyde and I we're also doing workshops and webinars probably for the last decade or more for treasurers, in our both in a volunteer capacity and related to the day job. So today, as I say, we're going to deal with situations that we hope you don't have to face. In particular, we see congregations losing charitable status. I see it used to be hundreds, it's now dozens every year, and it can arise from just any number of things, just a failed address change, someone getting sick. There's all kinds of reasons, but we always say that the most important thing to do as a treasurer, or one of the most important, certainly for maintaining charitable status, is to get that T3010 submitted on time. If you're late with that, it triggers even a temporary loss of charitable status that can have all kinds of consequences. We're also going to look at it from the point of view of United Church structures. So single point charges are pretty easy for everyone to understand when it comes to the charity land, and you have the same number. In those situations, you'll have the same CRA number for your payroll, for your HST, for your charitable number, and so on. In multi-point situations, it's not quite as straightforward. So with that, after this webinar, and I say this to treasurers all the time, look yourself up on the CRA website and see what it says about you. See what it says. This is what a donor might see if they looked you up, but in particular, look to see what your official legal CRA name is. Look to see that you're current, and make sure that you've also got this information on your tax receipts for your processing. Is the name of your charity on your tax receipt? It needs to be that CRA name, even if you operate with a few different names, also known as or whatever. It's extremely important from a compliance point of view. Most importantly, if you can't find yourself with a simple search, I've had treasurers, I tell them to do this, they go do it, and they can't find themselves. And it could be because they have lost charitable status. So go check that out for sure. And there are basically two ways that charitable status is handled at an individual church level. If charitable status is held by individual churches, then each church has its own charitable number. They each file their own T3010. If a charitable status is held at the pastoral charge level, in multi-point situations where typically in the United Church parlance, I think of it as a unit of ministry where pastoral charges share a minister. In that situation, individual churches do not have their own charitable number. There's a consolidated T3010 reporting, and the CRA doesn't know if there's 5 churches under there or 2, or for that matter, 1, because the pastoral charge is very much a United Church construct, although I think it applies to other denominations as well. So the first test for the United Church is when you are dealing with a pastoral charge change, does the outside world care? Is it relevant to the outside world? So the CRA cares about the name charity, and so that's why I suggest checking your name. If you're a single point, your name is likely to be your charitable name, or you might have you might be Knox United Church, or in some cases you might be called Knox Pastoral Charge. And that will vary. It's quite common to have it different. And in that case, on your receipts, you should say also known as. Many changes are internal to the church. If we reorganize a number of churches in pastoral charges, maybe the CRA doesn't care. The determining factor is where charitable status is held. And just to say, if a charity's name is changing, or a charitable number is needed, or a charitable number needs to be retired, you need to work with the CRA, but also the national office, because we will almost always have to issue a confirming document to get those changes underway. So if you have a multi-point pastoral charge where the pastoral charge has status, as I said before, you're potentially consolidating the finances of a number of different churches. And the CRA doesn't even know what's under there because they're getting a consolidated report. If one church closes, you need to report the accounting related to that, but there isn't a CRA impact. That the pastoral charge still exists. If a point is added to that pastoral charge, again, there isn't any direct CRA impact because they wouldn't know who's under there, unless perhaps that church previously had its own charitable status, in which case it would need to retire the number and would actually be an amalgamation. If a point becomes a pastoral charge on its own, this happens occasionally. I call it divorces, and that's maybe an offensive term to some, but if a pastoral charge splits and they were sharing or using one charitable number, then they need to keep doing that for a significant period of time and work that into their plans, because the point that has to go out and get a charitable number, that takes at least 4 to 6 months. And the CRA will say 6 to 9 because they allow for some back and forth. So my point is that where the pastoral charge has charitable status, you need to look at it not just from the inside United Church perspective. Oh, do I have my approvals for my next council, regional council, and all that kind of stuff? It's way more relevant what the banks or the regulator requires. So when each church has individual charitable status, it's a little more straightforward. In some cases, the CRA won't know that the pastoral charge exists or whatever the heck that is, because it's a layer of internal United Church governance. It might have payroll responsibility, and therefore it might have a completely different CRA number from the underlying churches. But again, what the CRA wants to know is what happens to the charitable number. So if there's a closure, each point would close on its own. It doesn't really, the pastoral charge stuff, even consolidating financials for a pastoral charge, the outside world doesn't care. So again, when we talk about amalgamations, that's churches coming together. Some are not amalgamations from a CRA perspective, because from a CRA perspective, it's charities coming together. If there aren't charities coming together, you may not have to tell the CRA at all. They don't know or care unless an entity with a charitable number, something changes about that. Either that charitable number is being retired, or it's being combined in an amalgamation with another charitable number. And typically what we do is we keep one of the existing charitable numbers going forward, and we use the word amalgamation always with CRA, not merger, not consolidation, because legally in an amalgamation, the history is carried forward. And for example, if you had a bequest to one of the prior churches, you wouldn't have to get all kinds of lawyers involved. You would have legal documentation showing that the successor body, which is entitled to receive the bequest, is the newly amalgamated entity. Mm. So routine changes. If there's a name change for any number of reasons, you need to tell the CRA, and you can't start using that name for things like payroll or even bank accounts and so on until the CRA confirms. The CRA does accept those changes, though, from the national office, which would take away the requirement. Like if a local church requests it, the CRA will come back and say, hey, you need a letter from the national office. If the national office requests it, that by definition means that we're supportive of the change, and it just happens more quickly. We routinely we tell people that a name change will take about 4 weeks, and that timing typically holds up. Where there's an amalgamation, a combining of charitable numbers, and usually the administration, there needs to be a local request for that, a national letter of good standing and support, and again, you typically decide on the name of the new entity and which charitable number you want to keep, and then you fire up the paperwork. If you're closing, and we're going to talk about that in more detail, because closing it has to be done well, or it can create all kinds of headaches for many months and even years afterwards for church administrators. There's special forms that have to be completed, and as you see here, I mentioned a T2046, but you also want to have a final T3010. And ideally, that T3010 would include a financial statement where you've already dealt with your charitable assets, getting those charitable assets to other charities. So I've talked about a letter of good standing. As I say, it's provided by the national office whenever needed. Increasingly, folks are needing it if they're changing their banking relationships. Sometimes if they're applying for a grant from a government body. And basically what we say in it is, hey, our churches, even though they're not incorporated, because everyone's looking to have letter patent and bylaws and the things you expect with a corporation. We are a very unique beast and have to keep explaining ourselves. The congregation is still governed by the United Church of Canada Act of Parliament from 1925 and subsequent changes to that. We confirm that the requested change has been internally approved, that whatever's happening with the charitable numbers, and that the local folks are, if it's a banking or something, we explain that the local trustees are authorized to deal with property or with banking. When do you need one? You need one if you're applying for a charitable status. And here's a slide I didn't quite update fully. That T2050 should be crossed out for regaining charitable status. For any legal change to the charity where a CRA notification is required or approval is required. So that would be if you were changing government documents as well as name changes and so on. The know your client requirements of banks and investment firms, increasingly we have to explain, particularly if something's being processed at the local level. Everybody asks to see your corporate bylaws and resolutions and all those kinds of things, most of which we don't have. And I have, over the last 12 years, explained this to so many different government bodies and so on, that most federal and provincial government departments anticipate or have learned what the United Church situation is, and we don't have to keep explaining ourselves, but sometimes we do. And we still bump into certain grant situations, granting bodies where they are absolutely insistent that you have to be incorporated, and that's a knockout for our congregations. So, as I said earlier, and just to stress this point, if you're in transition, and these are these unique niche situations that we've talked about, if a congregation is splitting in a way where one of the congregations is left without a charitable number, you have to continue to work together for at least, I'm going to say, half a year to allow the new application charitable number process to roll out. And that would still mean continuing to file your T3010 as if you hadn't split out. Continuing to use the tax receipting. Even as you're administratively separating, you still need to bring that together until a new charitable number is made available to whoever has to go through that process. If there's a closure or a windup of a charitable number, strong advice is do not file your final T3010, nor complete your paperwork to say you're closed until you've dealt with the assets. If you don't do that, there's a fair bit of work around needing to explain what happens or where those charitable assets went, and you're accountable for those charitable assets in a very significant way. There's 100% tax on residual charitable assets, and that can be hundreds of thousands of dollars if your property, for example, is still showing on a balance sheet. So the routine changes, folks, are name change. You notify the CRA and wait. Letter of good standing, no problem. Amalgamation, again, these are the elements. You need a local request from each entity. You need a letter of good standing, and typically you will keep one of the numbers and say what your new name is. And we do amalgamations after the fact. We often want to change the name of the go-forward entity, because that enables you to set up your banking and your payroll and all those kinds of things without being hung up on the time frame that it takes for CRA. So, special attention to closures. Do not answer yes the question A2 on the T3010 during windup, unless the balance sheet is taken to zero. Otherwise, it's going to trigger a 1-year window from when they process it. So that means it's probably 2 years where you have to hang around, and they're still writing the trustees who thought they were done. So a very strong recommendation. And we say this obviously in our T3010 webinar as well. Trustees may need to hang around for years for property disposition, depending on whether they think that's a duty that's important to them in the community, or whether they're just persevering to help the church. They could consider transferring property title to the regional council just to basically hand off that headache and be able to have an orderly closure. And as I've said repeatedly here today, the ideal scenario is a final T3010 filing with a zero balance sheet. So we've mentioned this form a few times, and it's probably not something folks have ever seen or dealt with. There's a revocation tax. It's an actual tax return, unlike our information return where we just provide some stats and some finances. You owe 100% tax on the value of any remaining assets when you close down a charity after you've paid all your debts. And the way you take that tax to zero is by either spending it on charitable activities. It could be your closure events. It could be, certain memorial services and so on. And also what we often do is we disperse residual monies to an eligible donee. That's basically another charity. It could be your regional council. It could be mission. And each region has a property policy that prescribes some of this. And quite often that includes contributions to the Mission and Service Fund, perhaps a local archives fund, also a contribution to the Justice and Reconciliation initiatives of the United Church. Basically, we're looking for that money to continue to do United Church priority mission activity. But you also need to do it for compliance reasons. I have the son of an elderly treasurer who I spoke with yesterday, who got a tax bill in the mail for $860,000. And they say, you owe us this. And imagine both a son who didn't know anything about it, or this is a woman who had closed a church a few years ago and thought she was done. So most importantly, through all of this, make sure that you close a file well and properly. And that takes us to sort of a first stopping point. There's no one out there to ask questions, but I thought Stephen or Clyde might comment at this stage.
Yeah, I'm always curious, Eric. It's always interesting to hear you talk, and you're really clear today. So I don't have a whole lot of questions, but I'm imagining the kinds of things that our regulars might ask. One of the things that maybe the major thing that jumped out at me is that this is complicated and rare, and the consequences of doing it wrong are enormous, like $860,000. Are you the only person who knows this stuff in the church, or is there somewhere else that they can get help as they're walking through this?
Well, certainly there are other resources. There's a property commission or a property committee or something, and property policies with every regional council. I have embraced some of the CRA stuff just because it was a gap for many places in the church, but also because the CRA is used to dealing, does appreciate having a single point of contact. So they give out my name routinely. But the message, basically, the easy message for treasurers is, if you have an organizational change, don't don't even start doing it yourself. Don't just call the CRA, call your local regional council, or for that matter, call the national office, because these are still infrequent enough that it's way better to get it right.
Do you want to add anything to that, Clyde?
Yeah, I'll just I agree with what Eric said on that point, but I was going to comment on the T2046,
Okay.
having done a couple of them. And the thing is with it that if you do it right, as Eric has already pointed out, and get your balance sheet down to zero, then the T2046 will be required, but it's just a whole lot of zeros. It's very easy to fill out at that point.
Yeah,
So,
and the rigor too of that final form, if you're doing it on a T3010, you just report your numbers and you're done. If you have to do it on that form, they're looking for cashed checks or signed receipts to confirm where your money went. And if you're doing that a couple of years after the fact, it can be a headache, as I'm sure Clyde found out.
yeah.
The other thing that I really appreciated in your presentation was just in the last slide where you were talking about eligible donees. If you're trying to disperse your charitable assets, I liked the stress you put on encouraging treasurers and trustees to disperse to other United Church entities. I've seen a lot of church closures where the trustees wanted to give monies to a different charity, I mean, a legitimate Canadian charity, maybe Habitat for Humanity or something or other, but our assets were given to the United Church. And I always kind of grieve when the monies go to something other than a United Church donee. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I agree. Secondly, there has been a significant, even in 2012, there was a general council resolution that basically said that United Church assets, if redeployed, should go towards United Church priorities. We also try to honor a little bit the community commitment and a desire, in many cases, to want to give back to a community where there may not be a United Church. So our property policies across the country, which are regional in our polity, do provide for some say local, from local, but they offer a much more guidance than they used to. So there are in virtually every region property policies that talk about contribution to justice and reconciliation, mission and service, mission and service endowment in some cases. And as a practical matter, the church I worship at, I didn't help build. I didn't, make a capital contribution to build this magnificent building. And I have some duty to pass that on to a next generation.
Thanks for that. Those are the only things that jumped out at me in the first part. Anything else, Clyde, before we move on?
Nope, that's all covered well.
Okay. Well, folks, we're going to switch gears here. It was important to describe the United Church context and some of the structural stuff. Now we're going to talk about getting, we're not going to talk about losing charitable status. We're going to talk about getting it or regaining it. And here's something that's dramatically changed. The regulars on our Treasure broadcasts will know that we've, by now, every single United Church should have a My Business account, and by now should hopefully have cleaned up being able to access it and knowing who the people are. And Clyde has given a lot of advice on that. But here's the thing: if you, according to the CRA and the CRA website, give you a workaround, but the CRA doesn't even accept an effort to regain your charitable status or for a new charity to get charitable status without getting this first, without getting the My Business account first.
Right.
So that's how much the world has moved forward through the pandemic. I would say, maybe 10 or 15% of United Churches had done this pre-pandemic, And then, of course, we all had to for the various government programs, the Q subsidies and so on. So it's a much higher percentage now, but basically it needs to go to 100, folks. And here are the steps. And just to stress, because so many people question this, the first thing you do when you go to set one of these up is prove that you're a Canadian taxpayer. You do have to provide your social insurance number and even have your tax form around somewhere, because they'll want to confirm a line from your most recent tax return. That isn't intrusive. That's the best security there is, because you're not giving that to them forever. You're just proving that you're a legitimate person. And then you're going on to say that you're associated with a charity. So just a few words about charitable status. Life is way easier if you're not a charity. So we'll talk a little bit why it's important, maintaining it, and then, of course, the fact that the T2050 is obsolete. There are lots of churches that don't have charitable status. And they, frankly, can do some things like whatever they want. They can adopt a local family and give and direct money because it isn't bound by charitable rules. So there are some interesting things where if charity law is intended, or charity regulations actually limit certain types of benevolence. And those are all rules that we've talked about a lot about in other situations. So, but if you do have charitable status, which is the norm and is how people think, and we've now trained people to expect a tax receipt, then it needs to be obtained, maintained, and the way you do that is by basically filing an annual charitable return and following a few key rules, mainly around receipting and anything related to the tax code. A point I make here is if you're a single point charge, as we talked about before, your CRA number should be the same one. It should be whatever it is, 9 digits plus a suffix for payroll, a suffix for GST, HST, a suffix for your charitable number. And then where that can be different is where you have a multi-point situation, because your charitable number or your payroll might be up at the pastoral charge level. So if you're applying for charitable status, a new application, you need to apply online. And I think we'll probably do, and I haven't told Clyde this yet, but I'll probably ask him to do it. I haven't done one of these online, but one way or another, we'll figure out how to walk through an online application process, including uploading all the documents and so on. But to do that, it will take 4 to 6 months at least. That's if everything is in order and there's no back and forth. And as I mentioned, you need a letter of good standing for a United Church. You need a letter of good standing, basically certifying that you're in good standing, which means, among other things, that you've paid your assessment and you are advertise yourself as a United Church, and off we go. If it's a re-registration situation, that's where if you've lost charitable status, again, you need to apply online. You need a letter of good standing. Typically, you're reapplying because you lost your charitable status due to failing to file your T3010. So they're basically going to ask for all the missing T3010s and charge you a $500 fee. I've seen it get waived, but I think you should always ask. But the greater likelihood is, unless you can say that there's some fault of theirs, don't count on it. If your charitable status has been lost for 4 years, it's not worth going back to do all that work. It's literally, and they basically say don't, and just apply for a new charitable number. Realize that this can happen if you've had an odd circumstance, if your treasurer left suddenly or died, and no one else knew that they were doing a T3010 every year, I've seen situations where churches have been running for years and years without charitable status. And the only way that, the way that gets caught is if someone does an audit of a taxpayer, and all of a sudden, and now they do look up the charitable number on each receipt. They didn't used to, but now they do, and they find charities that have lost charitable status. So that can be very, very embarrassing, and frankly, it happens every year, not very often, but once or twice a year. So the reason we get charitable status, the only way you can give tax receipts. You also, even to get funding from foundations and from other charities, you typically need to be a qualified donee, which is a fancy way of saying more or less a charity. And of course, you qualify for GST and HST rebates that are most generous in Ontario, but are still pretty nice in the Atlantic provinces, and there's some degree of rebate for charities across the country. If you don't rely on donations, if your donors don't require tax receipts, or if there's too much paperwork, maybe there are lots of faith-based entities that choose not to go the charitable status route. And in our case in the United Church, we some of our Indigenous communities on reserve, tax receipts aren't a meaningful element unless there are donors from outside the community. And in those situations, I do encourage our Indigenous communities to have charitable status, so that folks like me can send a donation, or so that my church can send along support as well. Okay, so applying for charitable status, it's all online. I include the web link here, and we obviously have printed copies. The slides are available on ChurchX. And so moving right along, this is a little part of what the checklist you would find on that web page. They take you through a very, in my opinion, customer-friendly walkthrough of what you need. You answer some basic questions online to tell you what kinds of documents you're going to need. Considerable attention to describing your activities, and there are certain key points that I'm going to talk about as we go through this. If you have activities outside of Canada, there are lots of questions around that, because there's a different level of requirement around how to demonstrate direction and control. You aren't necessarily, you might be writing checks, or you might be sending mosquito nets or something, but you aren't there. And so monies do go astray internationally. So there's a different, so they take you through a number of questions, and then you apply online. That's applying for charitable status. And this is literally paste from the web screen. Again, you go in through My Business Account. They ask you, are you applying for the first time? Have you already submitted an application? Are you reapplying? Are you a head body or internal division? So again, our congregations are internal divisions. So once you've logged in, first requirement again, folks, is you got to have a My Business Account, and they make it nice and easy for you. Then you go through the application process. This is where they give you the tiniest bit of wriggle room in number 3 here. You can now start completing the form. Here are the tips, all the things you can click on. If you have difficulty accessing the digital services or have questions regarding the application, you can contact the Charities Directorate. So again, they're not even telling you that there's another way to do it other than, and this slide may sound a little unkind. First of all, to regain charitable status, you again have to do it through My Business Account, and you literally need to reach out to the Charities Director, because your information is no longer online. The T3010s and stuff fall away. So here's the one secret you can take away. What the CRA doesn't tell you. There is a paper option, but it won't be offered to you unless you ask and beg and perhaps even sound especially helpless with technology. I've done this walk with a couple of folks, and there's a form called a T1789, which will not show up if you search it online, and it replaces the old and now obsolete T2050. But it basically looks like the online process, except put on paper. But again, this is how hard the world is going to digital. They don't even tell you that it exists, nor frankly, in my opinion, should they. So as we get into this form and online, a couple of key points. In identifying, you are part of the United Church of Canada if you're a community of faith applying for charitable status. If you don't have a parent organization, if you're an incorporated ministry, if you're doing some form of social services or housing or whatever, advocate, if you're incorporated, you must have the normal incorporation documents, the letters patent, and those kinds of things. And again, as most of you know, you're already filing this information on T3010s. But if you're new to applying, you need to know that you do have a parent organization for compliance purposes, and this is the charitable number of the parent organization. Now, these forms that I have here are not screen prints of the application process, but they are questions that from the old style, and I carried them forward because the context is still the same. They need to know if you're re-registering or applying first time. They need to know if you're an internal division, exactly what I just said. Okay? Because you don't have your own governing documents, and in some cases, my own church is writing a constitution right now, but that is not the legal document that is filed with the Charities Directorate. The legal documents that govern United Churches, at least, are the manual, which is available online, and the United Church of Canada Act. And that is what we reference in our, when we provide information to the CRA. One of the things, there's a couple of threshold questions that the CRA asks. They ask, do you get more than 50% of your income from one other place? Now, that will never be that could only be the case for us in a new mission unit type startup. But it is one of the threshold questions they ask about. They also want to know that 50% of your directors aren't all related. If they are, you can't get charitable status. So these are kind of knockout type questions. The handwriting is mine. Has the organization received or will receive more than 50% of its capital from one person? Probably not. Okay, again, maybe in a mission support situation, but typically not. Are people at non-arm's length? In other words, they're very sensitive to the notion of related parties potentially getting charitable status, for not always charitable reasons. So the whole notion of related parties is a question that are asked. Again, if you had to answer the question around not at arm's length, we're all members of the United Church of Canada if we're a United Church ministry applying. So I have a checkpoint for questions, but I think I'm going to keep going here and just take us through more of the questions that will be asked. As I've said before, most congregations will not be getting more than 50% of their revenue from one donor. Mission support is an example. maybe in a brand new congregation, if there's a sponsoring agency or something, but typically that won't be the case. What you will be asked about is your purpose. Again, your charitable purpose is a key element. Charitable purpose and activities are key elements when you're applying to be a charity. And so for us, it's always two of the current legal charitable purposes. There could be education as well, but furtherance of religion is an obvious one. And quite often we're also working on social justice issues, and that tends to fall under the relief of poverty as a broad catch-all. And you need to use active sentences. So here are some samples of what you would typically put on your T3010, and you would describe as programming if you were applying for charitable status. And again, they're also, what are they asking for around charitable activities? Is it brand new, or are you already doing? They're asking for samples of any newsletters or annual reports. If you're brand new, like in a lot of cases, we will have been going on for some time, so you would provide existing financial statements as a routine requirement. And when they ask about activities, one of the things they'll ask about is, are activities outside of Canada? And again, I mentioned earlier, that's one of the areas that gets additional scrutiny. There are all kinds of wonderful international focused charities. But for the United Church, if your primary focus is local, you might express any global support through your contribution to an M&S, mission and service fund, but you wouldn't have direct activities. So generally the answer would be no. And whatever your activities are, whether they're inside Canada or outside, they're asking for some physical examples of minutes, newspaper articles, annual reports, that kind of thing. So again, if you're applying, you've probably been around for a while, you're already carrying out their activities. You generally won't have activities outside of Canada at startup. And then the kind of things that they'll be looking for as attachments now uploaded to your My Business account are minutes of meetings, articles, newsletters, and so on. And the individual I worked with provided 5 years of everything in their application, and it was like 300 pages, and just even PDFing all of that. My advice is, like, if you exist, a sampling is fine. Like one or at the most 2 annual reports and a couple of newsletters or something. It should be more than sufficient to demonstrate what you do to the CRA. So activities, now we get to the business side. They'll be asking about how you derive your revenue. So revenue from the sale of assets or the use of assets. Again, you'll describe what you do. None of these will necessarily apply to you, but rental of community space, rummage sales. And here's another question they ask is, how much of this is done with volunteer, like how much of the charity's resources are being used, say, to generate revenue? Well, for most of us, I'm not going to say make it up, but don't spend a lot of time on the estimate either. Like if it's being done by volunteers, if your stewardship programs, are volunteers and they issue letters or whatever, it's a very low percentage of the charity's resources. What percentage of human resources are volunteers? It can be as high as 100% in a lot of cases, but particularly for human resources. But you might have a paid minister and some staff, but it's a very squishy number because you're also trying to capture the volunteer element. So effort and proportion of money and resources spent on fundraising is something they ask about. They ask about this on an annual T3010 too, because it's a warning flag. If you're spending 50% of your resources raising money, that's generally considered inefficient. So for a new charity, they ask this question up front. And they'll also ask around, what rental activity you might have or special events. And again, the key elements are how much do you spend on fundraising, and also what is the proportion of volunteer effort that goes into certain of these activities. Now, moving on to financial information, you're going to typically attach your financial statements. If you don't have financial statements yet, you might attach your proposed budget. And just to say that the CRA used to allow United Churches or churches generally to have to choose their own fiscal reporting period. So we do have churches around the country. I know of several in Toronto that have, for example, a June year end, which maps to a church programming cycle. But that's no longer allowed. They will not allow folks to change and they do expect any new church to have to comply with the fiscal period that the national church does, which is a calendar fiscal. So most churches will have some rental revenue. Most will have some special events, whether it's community dinners, rummage sales, bake sales, and for the most part, you'll be asked again how much staff time goes into those. Again, usually it's a very significant volunteer-driven thing, and that should be, you need to be factual, but that will be part of your message. Again, you talk about how much of the community, they're asking about volunteer resources, and then they're asking about financial resources, like what goes in to support these activities. And all of these questions are driven by the notion that the work needs to be charitable, and therefore, the volunteer aspect is important. The amount of resource spent on fundraising is important. A question we get quite often is reporting the ownership of the church. Okay, and basically, most United Churches, the title is held locally, ideally in the name of the quote unquote the trustees of XYZ United Church, and you would report that on your application. And you would provide the address and potentially the values that go with it, because that is where the assets are managed. Decisions related to the assets are made by those trustees, but also requiring regional approval in our polity. But again, that is where you would disclose where title is held. And this is the old chart, but I think it's virtually identical. A very rough and simple little balance sheet that fits on one page. You get 10 pages to list your activities, and you get 1 page to list your financial resources, and that's probably perhaps how it should be. So the existing financial statements need to be attached, and as I mentioned before, your calendar year now has to be December 31, and we do have some folks out there that are grandfathered. A note to our mission support receiving congregations. It is revenue that you would report as a charity, and it would count as money from another charity, which in this case would be the United Church of Canada Mission and Service Fund. On the revenue side, there's gifts from individuals. If you have some kind of corporate support, or in an Indigenous case, sometimes band council contributions. You need to show that separately. And of course, your fundraising revenue. You notice they don't ask very much about expenses. And the reason is that, if you're starting a charity, you're going to need to find a way to balance the books. And they're much more concerned from a compliance perspective and from a tax code perspective, much more concerned about revenue. As we've talked about before, the letter of good standing, I repeat this slide because it applies not only to the changes that we talked about earlier, but to any application for charitable status or to regain charitable status. And you're basically saying what number. You're talking about the local trustees being authorized to. You're confirming that they're authorized to make this application, and you're confirming what the governing documents are. So you need it for new charitable status. You need it for regaining. You need it for any legal change to the registered charity. And increasingly, as I say, banks, investment companies, and governments ask for this as well. So it's provided nationally. Frankly, it's a form letter request that happens to go out under my signature, but I don't even see all of them because it's a standard administrative task and confirmation. And then when the last bits of information, finishing the application, very important to stress that in the same way that we need trustee birth dates and director birth dates on an annual T3010, you need to have them. You need to have this information at application time as well. And if there's still any residual sensitivity out there, you can leave it blank on the form. I'm not sure how you provide a sealed envelope online, but that might be a question that we need to dig into a little more. Key elements, you really want to prevent the back and forth. So you want to make sure every question is answered. You want to keep a soft copy of everything. The great part about an online application is you know what you gave them. It's there. They see it, and they give you status reporting on it. So if you can get it right the first time, the My Business Account approach is really going to be a time saver for treasurers going forward. When you can just look up all the stuff and know where you stand, much less stress than waiting to get something in the mail or being shocked when you do get something in the mail. So I'm going to just flip the last couple of slides. Maybe I'll ask Clyde to comment, but just to say that the charities director is the benevolent, nice side of the CRA. All of us get nervous if we get a CRA audit letter, but they really have done an outstanding job of trying to find ways to support small charities, very much focused on education. They've dialed down their audit activity, but there's still audit activity, and their customer service is very, very good. Now, that being said, Clyde, what about audits?
Audits are no problem at all. They just take time. And the CRA actually, in general, is moving towards the education side of things. I know in the HST, GST area, the Excise Tax Act, in that part of it, their number one way of doing things is to educate. And so any new charity that starts, along with any new business that starts up, may get a telephone call from the CRA saying, we want to sit down and talk to you about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and we can give you advice on what we need. And that's a very positive thing they've been actually working on for about 4 years now. So don't fret over an auditor. You can always tell them what you want, but be nice. And they'll probably reciprocate. They will come out and look at different things. An audit generally is triggered by something they found from somewhere else. doing a personal audit or a business audit, and the charity came up in it, mainly through their tax receipting. They spend a lot of time looking at these and making sure that they're all proper. And when they come in and they got specifics on tax receipts, this is where you need a copy, and it can be a electronic file, but you need to be able to locate the receipts to prove that you actually issued them. They've seen a few of them, maybe too many of them, that were large dollars, and it just didn't fly right. So it may not be you that they're really auditing. It's just support that they're asking you for, so they can finish their audit of something else. The part-time employees versus independent contractors, that's a problem that they face all along. A lot of it is on the perception of the person who's in the role, but there are some very specific guidelines published. And if you do a search on the CRA website for independent contractors, you'll get a booklet that tells you how to determine whether they're independent or whether they're actually a part-time employee. Yes, the government's looking for their dollars, but they're also looking to make sure that nobody's ripped off somewhere along the way in what benefits they might be able to get as a part-time employee. Care with designated gifts. This comes more under a provincial jurisdiction, because you're operating as a trust. And when you have a designated gift, it has to be used for the right purpose. The suggestion I have there is make sure when you receive a designated gift that you don't cash the check or anything until you know that your pastoral charge is willing to accept that gift with the strings attached. Because once you've cashed the check, it's almost too late to deal with it. And if you don't have, well, a story I like to tell is about a church that took in $40,000 for church bells, but they didn't have a church tower. And it would have cost them a fortune. And they had to apply to court to get out of that money because they had already accepted it. So be careful of what you're taking in as designated gifts, but make sure they're recorded appropriately so that you can be sure they're following through and being used as it should be. And all of this should be documented at the board level. Yes, the finance committee or the stewardship committee is going to be looking at it, but those kind of decisions have to go to the board and make sure that if it's not a decision making, at least it's recorded there that this is what's going to happen and that the board approves that. You have a lot of things, as the slide says, 4 points to remember of the CRA audit. You will receive an audit notification, and it will tell you whether it's a field audit or a desk audit. Desk audit is obviously a lot easier. I've been through a number of these where they send it out. They say, here's the documents that we want, and you just prepare them and send them back to them. Through your My Business account, you can send them PDF of all of these documents, and they can all be uploaded very quickly. And they like it that way because then the files don't sit on their desks as long. So they become nicer people. If you delay sending things to them, they don't always keep the same friendly face up front. Field audit is a little different in that they'll actually come out and come into your church or wherever your records are and want to see the records and documentation right there. Just be prepared for it. They still will tell you what they're looking for and have it all laid out, ready to go. They'll come in expecting to spend 2 or 3 days, and they'll tell you how long they expect to spend. And if you can have them out of there in half a day, they're happy. And it will go very easy for you. If there's something comes up that is very contentious, they will write you about it. They will tell you what they've found, and they will ask for certain things to be corrected. If it becomes contentious, go consult counsel and make sure it is a counsel who is used to dealing with the CRA, because some of them never even talk to the CRA. And that's not one you want to be paying bucks to. You want to make sure you've got somebody who knows what they're doing. The last point, or second last point here, is to manage the audit day. If they come in on a field audit, you should have only one person there who can answer all their questions, or as many as possible, but don't have two or three, because as soon as there's a little bit of discussion between two or three of you as to what is going to answer the question, it raises more red flags. So give them cooperation and do not hide anything. I have seen audits go right off the rails because the auditor was able to say that this person was trying to hide something. And they just went after all kinds more than what they had started out at. So let them have the information they want. They can ask for it. They can ask for up to 4 years back without any special warrants or anything. It's just one of the things that happens. Normally, they'll only do a 2-year audit. But if they want to more, they can go back 4. And if they really want to push it, they can go back further, depending on what it is they're finding. When you finish an audit, again, they will send you a letter and tell you everything that was found. They'll list the praises as well as the areas that they want more information done. They will have already discussed with you what they're looking for to be corrected, and they will talk about time limits on getting it done. If you get something like that, work at it diligently to get those things completed in the time limit, because I have seen auditors return unannounced and ask for information. And that's where they've come away with a feeling that, gee, this may not get done. And so they come in unannounced, and you've got it done. You got nothing to worry about. It works really well. And I think that's just about the end of what we've got here.
It is, and you know, all the newspaper reports suggest that audit activity is down markedly, but I think some of that might have been pandemic and all kinds of challenges. So it's something, again, we hope not to have to deal with, but if we do, it's always good to reach out to someone who's done it before. And as you can tell, Clyde certainly has, and I've had a couple myself. The key is that, again, it is service oriented, and you don't get blindsided. They tell you what they're looking to put in. They give you a chance to rebut it before. There's an iterative process, and you know, as I say, I can't sing. I sing the praises of the Charities Directorate all the time. So again, this is a special purpose webinar. We've tried to cover niche administrative and compliance type topics. If you have any questions on this or suggestions for future items, we've got the contact information here for myself, Clyde, and for Stephen.
Well, and thank you, Clyde, and especially Eric, because I know you put a lot of effort into pulling those slides together. Very, very helpful and important information for people whenever they might need it. We're going to create a special section at the ChurchX page that we're using, where we can collect programs and resources like this that don't have a specific date attached. This is information that you need if you hit a special circumstance. And so it's going to have its own section, and I would welcome topic requests from anybody who's watching this. Are there other topics like this that are specific to a certain situation? Maybe they don't belong in our regular stream of monthly gatherings, but they sure would be useful in a library of evergreen resources just in case. Let me know. Use my email that was on the screen there, and let me know the topics that you might be interested in, and we will make this the first of several different offerings and slowly build a catalog of resources together that I hope will be useful to all of you who are doing this important volunteer work across the church. Thank you for your ministry, and it is a ministry to be a treasurer. Thank you for your work as a trustee. Thank you for your work managing property. These are technical skills that not everybody in the church has, and every congregation depends on them. It's often unsung work, and on behalf of the whole denomination, the three of us are grateful for your work, and we ask God's blessings upon it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, and bye-bye for now.